Welcome back to the Deep Dive. Today, we have a really significant document on the table. We're going to be undertaking a meticulous examination of the EC $2.078 billion budget for 2026. This was recently presented by Prime Minister Gaston Browne. And, a budget isn't just a spreadsheet. It's a nation's mission statement.
Yep.
And this one is already kicking up a fierce debate.
It really is, and you can see why right from the get-go.
Absolutely. Because on the surface, the government's narrative is one of undeniable, you could say, macroeconomic triumph.
Oh, for sure. They're proudly touting what they claim are historic overall surpluses.
And they're pointing to one figure in particular, the EC $116.3 million figure. That's the one being highlighted.
Right. And alongside that, maybe even more importantly, is the claim of a rapidly shrinking debt-to-GDP ratio.
Which they say is now down to 61.4%. And that number, 61.4%, it's really crucial, isn't it? It signals a kind of fiscal stability that gives them leverage on the international stage.
It's the number you show to lenders, to rating agencies. It's a sign of health.
Okay, let's unpack this. Because our stack of sources today, and especially this deeply critical commentary from a group called the People's Auditor, it suggests that these headline figures, all this celebratory talk, it might be masking some really profound cracks in the foundation of structural equity.
Precisely. And we have to acknowledge the budget is framed, and the commentary itself says this, as a masterful display of political and economic maneuvering. Achieving a surplus and hitting that 61.4% debt-to-GDP ratio.
Which, for context, is a big deal.
A huge deal. It often places a nation very favorably compared to its regional neighbors. It meets certain international lending targets. So, financially speaking, it is a significant feat.
There's always a but.
There's a big but. And the core challenge we have to address, and really the mission of this deep dive for you, the listener, is whether this fiscal stability is sustainable. And maybe more to the point, whether the budget passes the critical test of feasibility and realism for the majority of citizens, the people actually living and working there.
Right.
So we have to ask the difficult, maybe uncomfortable question. Is this macroeconomic success, are these shining headline figures being purchased at the expense of, or you could say funded by, an unequal burden that's being placed squarely on the shoulders of the general populace?
That's the real tension here, isn't it? This clash. On one side, you have the triumph of fiscal stability, those impressive, audited-looking numbers like the debt-to-GDP ratio and the surplus.
The numbers that get the good press release.
Exactly. And on the other side, pitted directly against it, is this alleged failure of structural equity and dignity. Dignity for the very people who are expected to fund it all. It's like we're looking at two sides of the same coin.
And this tension, it isn't just theoretical. You can see it in the specific mechanisms they're using to generate the revenue. You can see it in how the public workforce is treated, and you can definitely see it in the state of essential national infrastructure.
So that's our roadmap for today.
That's the plan. We are going to examine the specific claims of that surplus. We'll dissect the what the source calls the glaring inequity in public service treatment. And we're going to scrutinize the long-term critical neglect of core institutions, health, education, security, that seem to get a recycled promise every single year, but no concrete, verifiable funding to back it up.
So let's start right there at the top with the money, because that EC $116.3 million overall surplus, that's the star of the show. A surplus of that size, EC $116.3 million, declared by the Prime Minister. That immediately sends a message of responsible, excellent management. It's supposed to mean you collected more than you spent. Simple.
It's the gold standard of government accounting on the surface.
But the commentary we're analyzing, it immediately throws some cold water on that. It introduces this profound skepticism, asking a very basic question. How? How can a surplus of this magnitude just materialize in a single fiscal year, especially when you look at the recent past?
It seems to come out of nowhere.
It does. And the narrative seems a bit divorced from recent financial history. The source highlights a few key reasons for this skepticism. For instance, if such substantial surpluses were building up, or if they were so easily achievable, then why have citizens been facing what the auditor calls a heavy tax burden in the years leading up to this?
That's the logical disconnect.
Exactly. The source specifically points to two things, ABST and the RRC.
Right. And we should probably stop and clarify those for you, the listener, because those acronyms represent real money out of people's pockets. ABST is the Antigua and Barbuda sales tax. It's a consumption tax on goods and services.
So it's on almost everything you buy.
Pretty much. And RRC is the revenue recovery charge, which is often applied to imports. So it drives up the cost of anything that isn't produced on the island, which is a lot of things.
Those things.
Both are very effective at raising money for the government, but they're also deeply regressive. They hit lower-income households the hardest as a percentage of their income.
Okay, so with that context, the question becomes even sharper. If the state has been so fiscally stable that it can generate a surplus of over $100 million, why are citizens still getting hammered by these heavy consumption and import taxes?
And not just that, why was the government still borrowing money for major infrastructure projects, including essential roadworks, just last year? The commentary argues, and I think quite forcefully, that surplus figures seem decoupled from the reality of the nation's ongoing financing needs.
It's like they're prioritizing the headline number over actual public relief.
That's the core of the critique. It creates this crucial disconnect for the average person. You mentioned the borrowing for infrastructure. If the budget is so healthy, why are you still taking on more debt? And how does that shiny debt-to-GDP ratio of 61.4%, which looks great to the IMF, stack up against the actual cost to the public of achieving it?
It's a fascinating calculation, isn't it?
It really is. I mean, getting to 61.4% is often celebrated because regional bodies like the Eastern Caribbean Central Bank, the ECCB, they often set benchmarks around 60% for what they consider long-term sustainability.
So hitting this number is a political win.
A major political win. It signals stability to external lenders. But the auditor keeps asking this nagging question, at what cost? And this brings us directly to what our sources are calling the public contribution paradox. The surplus isn't magic. It didn't appear out of thin air. It's being generated by specific and, as we said, regressive mechanisms that fall disproportionately on the average citizen.
And the main mechanism, the one that sources really spotlight, is the duty on gas at the pump.
Exactly. Let's focus on that specific detail. The duty that is levied on every single gallon of fuel. The source material identifies this not just as a revenue stream, but as a hidden, highly effective tax on every citizen and business.
Hidden because you don't really see it. You just see the final price.
Precisely. Consumers often focus on that big number on the pump, not realizing that a significant chunk of that is government duty that's going straight into general revenue.
And when you think about the reach of that single tax, it's huge.
It's massive. It's pervasive. It hits every single segment of the economy. It hits private drivers, of course, but it also hits taxis and buses, which increases the cost of just getting to work for everyone.
It dramatically increases the cost for freight transport,
which then impacts the price of every single imported good on the supermarket shelves. It hits construction companies that rely on fuel for their heavy equipment. And critically, it impacts businesses that rely on fuel for their own electricity generation, especially given the need for backup power. It's basically a tax on movement, on commerce, and on survival.
So the paradox, then, is that the average consumer and the small business owner are the ones directly funding this impressive multi-million-dollar surplus narrative. They're doing it through these continuous mandatory contributions at the gas pump and with high ABST and RRC rates.
They are, in essence, the venture capitalists funding the government's fiscal triumph.
And yet, and this is the crux of it, what does the public get to see in return for funding this massive surplus?
The commentary is really blunt here. It stresses that they see no commensurate relief or infrastructure quality.
None. The money is clearly there for the headline surplus, that $116.3 million, but the most basic structural improvements that you'd expect to see with a healthy treasury are just conspicuously absent. And this is where the whole narrative completely breaks down and slams into realism.
And that leads us to probably the most visible, most frustrating failure for the average person. The road infrastructure.
The roads. Everyone has a story about the roads.
Yeah.
Everyone does. And the sources point out that the roadworks weren't just generally funded. They were publicly justified and supposedly funded by a specific increase in licensing fees. Now, this is a critical detail because a licensing fee represents a dedicated user contribution.
It's a fee for a service.
Exactly. You pay the fee specifically with the expectation of getting a well-maintained road network in return. It's supposed to be earmarked revenue, or at least that was the public justification given for the hike.
So the money is supposed to be ring-fenced for that purpose.
That's the idea. So we have these dedicated user fees coming in, designed specifically to fix the roads. So what is the reality of the roads themselves? The sources state that they remain, and I'm quoting here, deplorable.
That's not a word you use lightly.
No. They describe the government's approach as a quick-fix reality, just patchwork repairs that are easily destroyed during the first heavy downpour, which then requires the whole cycle to start over again almost immediately.
The implication here is actually far more damning than just, oh, the roads are bad. It points directly to what the source calls profound mismanagement within the Ministry of Works. Because if dedicated road funds are coming in from these licensing fees, and yet the quality is so bad that the government then has to admit it needs to borrow money to patch these same roads, well, you have a major structural problem.
It makes no sense.
It suggests one of two things. Either the dedicated funds are being immediately diverted or appropriated for other, perhaps less transparent purposes.
Or they're just being spent so incredibly inefficiently on these quick fixes that they achieve no lasting benefit, which then requires further borrowing anyway.
In that scenario, the public is effectively paying a triple tax. First, through the dedicated licensing fee they were told was for the roads. Second, indirectly, through the massive effective gas duty that's building up the national surplus. And potentially a third time, through future debt repayment when the government borrows money to fix the roads that the first two payments should have already covered.
It's an economic structure that basically institutionalizes waste and a complete lack of accountability. It means that impressive $116.3 million surplus starts to look less like a sign of economic genius.
And more like a straightforward consequence of leveraging very heavy, often hidden public taxation without any corresponding public relief or transparent management of how that money is spent.
It makes the whole macro success feel fundamentally extractive.
Exactly. And moving from the mechanics of how the state is financed, we can now shift our focus to the human engine of the state, the public workforce, which brings us directly to these profound structural issues of internal equity. This is where the commentary hits hardest on that concept of structural dignity.
Which is a powerful phrase.
It is. The budget, as we noted, is repeatedly labeled or framed as people-centered, yet the auditor identifies what it calls a glaring hypocrisy built right into that very claim. And what's fascinating here is the sheer codified disparity, and by codified I mean it's legally built into the system between the small political class.
So elected officials and top administrators.
Right, and the vast majority of the core public service. It's a two-tiered system operating under the very same budget.
And the benefits for that elite tier are detailed with striking clarity in the sources. We're talking about a very select group of high-ranking politicians and top permanent secretaries who command five-figure salaries. That salary gap alone is substantial enough to create a whole socio-economic chasm.
It's a different world.
Completely. But the disparity is then magnified by this array of generous taxpayer-funded benefits that come along with those high salaries. This includes things like high-end vehicle allowances, housing stipends, utility payments, and often discretionary funds.
These benefits basically insulate the political elite completely from the cost of living struggles that the majority of citizens are facing every day.
Struggles that their own policies, like that gas duty we just talked about, are actively making worse.
And then there's the issue of long-term security, specifically the pension system for the political class. The source highlights a really critical point here. A politician needs only a few terms in office to secure a full, robust pension.
A few terms, not a lifetime of service.
No. We are talking about a defined benefit guaranteed by the state that's achieved after a relatively short period of service. This system guarantees lifelong financial stability and security for them and for their families.
Okay, so now contrast this with the reality that's facing the essential workforce. The people who are dealing with those poor road conditions, the ones working in the neglected hospitals, the teachers in the under-maintained schools.
The people the commentary accurately calls the essential cogs that actually keep the government machinery from grinding to a complete halt.
What's their reality?
Well, the vast majority of these core public service workers are trapped near the EC $1,560 minimum wage.
Let's contextualize that number for the listener. EC $1,560 a month. In a high-cost environment, what does that actually mean?
It translates to roughly $52 a day. Now, when you start to factor in basic expenses like rent, utilities, rising food costs, which are being fueled by RRC and ABST, and then increased transport costs fueled by the gas duty, that $1,560 presents a chronic daily struggle just to cover the absolute basics. It is nowhere near a living wage.
So the pay is already incredibly low.
But the suffering actually extends beyond just the low pay. The source details the financial instability they face. These workers are apparently paid late, ever so often, and this is not just a technical glitch. This is described as chronic payroll mismanagement.
And we have to think about the human consequence of that. If you are living paycheck to paycheck on $15.60 a month, even a delay of 1 or 2 days in your payment, it forces you into a cascade of crises.
Absolutely. It could mean late bills that then incur extra fees. It could mean having to seek out short-term, high-interest, predatory loans just to feed your children.
Or not having the money to cover transport to even get to work to earn that late paycheck.
This chronic financial uncertainty doesn't just affect morale. I mean, it does, obviously, but it actively undermines the dignity and the stability of the very people who are responsible for executing government functions.
And that connection to the national operational capacity is so crucial. When the public service, the very body responsible for delivering education, for delivering health and security, is perpetually underpaid, navigating this constant financial instability, and at the same time watching the political class secure lavish benefits and lifelong security after a short tenure.
The entire concept of a motivated, effective, and functioning public sector just collapses.
It creates an operational liability for the entire nation. It's a structure where the administrators are completely insulated from the economic realities their policies create, while the people on the front lines, the ones dealing with the structural failures, like those poor roads or failing hospitals, are the ones suffering the most severe financial uncertainty and indignity.
It makes the budget's commitment to people-centered development ring completely hollow when its own workforce is treated as a low-priority expense that can be paid ever so often late.
The structural deficits caused by this two-tiered state and this public contribution paradox become even more visible, stark even, when we look at the core institutions, the ones that are essential for a society's long-term health.
Yeah.
Education, health, and security.
Right, and the budget does outline some substantial allocations here, but the auditor's critique focuses entirely on the strategic efficiency, or really the inefficiency of that spending.
Let's start with education. This sector received a very high visibility spending commitment. We're talking about a substantial EC $40.1 million increase in the education budget. That's a massive injection of funds.
It's a headline-grabbing number.
It is. And the stated high-profile purpose of this investment is to secure free tuition at UWI 5 Islands, making tertiary education accessible to all qualified students.
On the face of it, this is a phenomenal social deliverable. It opens the doors of university to those who couldn't have afforded it. It's a huge, quantifiable success story that looks fantastic in a press release and on the international stage.
Here's where it gets really interesting.
Yeah.
Because the critique shifts immediately from the amount of money being spent to the strategic sequencing and the purpose of that spending.
And this is where the commentary introduces this powerful concept of building the roof before the foundation. That $40.1 million is being spent entirely on the roof, the tertiary level, which is great. But its ultimate success is entirely dependent on the quality of the foundation.
The primary and secondary education systems that feed students into UWI in the first place.
Exactly. The foundational critique is devastatingly logical. If the foundational level, the preschools and the primary schools, is failing, if it's suffering from infrastructural decay, outdated materials, and teacher burnout due to low pay and late payments.
All the issues we just discussed in the last section.
All of them. Then the investment in UWI 5 Islands becomes inherently inefficient. You might have free tuition, but you won't have enough qualified students who are ready or able to take advantage of it. So that $40 million essentially ends up funding empty spots, or it forces the university to lower its standards just to accommodate underprepared students.
And the source material highlights specific examples of what this foundational gap actually looks like. It's not just a philosophical concept. It means schools that lack basic IT infrastructure. It means leaky roofs that destroy educational materials during the rainy season. It means a significant lack of resources for kids with specialized learning needs.
So the focus on tertiary expansion, the auditor notes, suggests a political preference for that high-visibility, quantifiable deliverable over the hard, localized work of upgrading primary school facilities.
It's the decentralized, messy, and less headline-worthy work of fixing actual desks and replacing damaged textbooks.
It's a classic example of political optics outweighing operational reality. The budget allocates $40.1 million to the highly visible roof. But the critique insists that if you don't ensure every primary school child receives a high-quality education and is ready for the next level, that massive allocation is funding a program that will operate at a greatly diminished return on investment. If the base is weak, the pinnacle will eventually crumble.
And moving from education to health, we see the exact same pattern. Massive promises running parallel to persistent, acute institutional neglect. The budget's flagship promise for 2026 is the transformation to a full national health insurance plan, an NHI plan.
Which is an immense, comprehensive, population-level promise. It requires sophisticated planning and massive capital outlay. It's a huge deal.
A huge deal. Yet at the very same time, the sources underscore the persistence of dire conditions at specific critical institutions, Fiends Institute and Clairview Psychiatric Hospital.
And for you, the listener, these institutions are responsible for some of the most vulnerable citizens, elderly individuals who require constant care, and those struggling with mental illness. Their conditions have been described as a long-running national scandal, a profound structural failure that really challenges the idea of a humane state.
And the specific institutional failure that's noted here is that the relocation or the total refurbishment of Fiends and Clairview is a recycled goal. It appears annually in budget talk without any subsequent concrete or definitive action.
We are talking about promises that have been repeated for years, maybe even for decades. It's gotten to the point where there's a complete loss of credibility. If the government can't even fund the basic care facilities for its most vulnerable citizens, how can the public possibly believe that a complex transformation to a comprehensive NHI plan is going to materialize?
And critically, that institutional failure is compounded by the treatment of the essential staff. The nurses and the healthcare staff who are struggling daily to manage in those dire conditions, they remain underpaid. And here's a direct moral and legal failure that's cited by the source. Many of them are still not receiving the promised COVID allowances.
Years after they were on the front lines during a global health emergency.
Let's just dwell on that specific point. This isn't just a mispayment. It's a broken promise to frontline workers who risked their lives. You have a budget that's focused on celebrating a macro surplus of over $100 million, yet the operational financial system cannot manage to pay essential workers the emergency allowances they were promised and are legally owed.
It dramatically undermines the credibility of the entire health transformation promise. The source basically asks, how can you credibly launch a massive, intricate NHI program when the staff necessary to run the existing essential facilities are unpaid, demoralized, and forced to work in decaying structures?
It's a question of basic competence and trust.
And this systemic failure extends directly into national security, particularly concerning the correctional system. Again, we see that familiar pattern. The ongoing promise. Year after year, there has been talk, there have been consultations, and there's been planning about building a new, modern prison facility. Everyone recognizes the inhumanity and the overcrowding of the current structure.
But when you actually look at the 2026 budget reality, what's missing is the tangible commitment. The budget lacks a definitive funded capital line item for a new facility.
And for a project of that scale, which requires massive land acquisition, design, and construction contracts, a vague promise or a tiny planning allocation is just. It's insufficient. A capital line item is a concrete financial commitment. Everything else is just talk.
So the consequences of this neglect are just compounding exponentially.
They are. The current situation perpetuates poor living conditions inside the existing facilities. It means poor food quality for inmates, and crucially, poor wages and allowances for the staff who have to work in a challenging and often dangerous environment.
And it extends beyond just the infrastructure, doesn't it?
Oh, absolutely. The failure extends to the entire mandate of rehabilitation and safety. The sources highlight a critical lack of government-funded programs and essential training for the staff. So this means the system is not only failing in its mandate to support and train the security personnel necessary to manage a modern correctional facility, but it's perpetuating a cycle of neglect that harms both the inmates and the employees. It is a crisis driven entirely by the budget's continuous failure to follow through on these annual core security and justice promises.
So if the previous section demonstrated this critical failure of core national institutions, this next segment examines how the ministerial allocations, or you could say the lack thereof, expose these strategic gaps and crucial issues of equity and accountability across different sectors.
Right. It's about connecting the dots between the money and the outcomes.
And let's start with a crucial and highly sensitive area that really touches on national identity and resource distribution. Barbuda.
A very important piece of the puzzle. The source scrutinizes the allocations across portfolios, and it highlights this profound disparity in Barbuda using what it calls the contribution versus receipt dynamic.
Okay, so what does that mean exactly?
It means that Barbuda, despite its relatively small size, contributes significantly to the national GDP. This is primarily through high-end land sales, hospitality, and tourism revenue that is generated on its communal land. They are generating substantial wealth that contributes to that very national surplus we were talking about earlier.
So they're putting a lot into the pot.
A lot. Yet the equity issue is staggering. The Barbuda Council, which is the constitutionally mandated local governing body, apparently has to fight to receive even the allowance that is constitutionally due to them.
So this isn't discretionary funding we're talking about.
Not at all. This is a mandated right to a portion of the revenue that is generated from their own resources, but they face a constant struggle and delays in actually accessing it.
Which signals a much deeper, more systemic issue than just, say, bureaucratic accounting.
Exactly. And the commentary calls for rigorous scrutiny of the specific capital allocation that's earmarked for Barbuda's tourism-driven infrastructure. The goal, the auditor insists, must be to ensure that this funding promotes equitable development and, crucially, the preservation of communal land rights, which are absolutely central to Barbudan identity and their economy.
The implicit worry here, and the reason for this call for scrutiny, is that these capital allocations might be strategically used to further centralize control over the revenue that's being generated by Barbudans, rather than genuinely empowering the local council and preserving the community's stake in its own development.
Right. The constant fight over their basic constitutional allowance suggests that local autonomy and revenue sovereignty are being systematically undermined by the very budget that claims to serve the whole nation.
Okay, so let's transition from there to the sports and creative industries portfolio. This again highlights a massive financial mismanagement issue, and it's framed as the one nation question.
Yes, and the source points out this persistent issue of persons a year later still asking for their just payment for events like Carnival.
A year later.
A full year. This is a devastating operational failure. It impacts the livelihoods of hundreds of local artists, designers, vendors, and small business owners who rely on Carnival revenue for their annual solvency. When your payment is delayed for a year, that is not just an inconvenience. For a small entity, that can mean bankruptcy or financial ruin.
And this reality raises some serious questions about how funds are being prioritized within that ministry.
The source material suggests a potential misallocation of funds. Is the funding mechanism prioritizing these high-profile, perhaps politically motivated events like a major One Nation concert that burn through a substantial amount of cash very quickly?
But leave behind this trail of unpaid local debts.
Exactly. Over the basic operational necessity of just paying local artists their contractual arrears and funding foundational year-round infrastructure. It's a choice between getting momentary political applause and fulfilling your fiduciary duty to your citizens.
This lack of strategic financial commitment also seems to pervade the analysis of agriculture and food security.
It does. I mean, if the government were truly prioritizing food security, which is a critical concern given rising global shipping costs and volatile international markets, the budget would have to reflect that urgency with concrete, massive funding.
And it doesn't.
The source argues that a true food security priority would necessitate a significant multi-million-dollar increase, not just in the recurrent budget for salaries, but in capital spending dedicated to local infrastructure. We are talking about things like modernized irrigation systems, large-scale refrigerated storage and warehousing facilities, advanced processing facilities, dedicated farmer support grants.
The nuts and bolts of a food system.
The real infrastructure. Without that concrete capital allocation, the nation remains chronically burdened by high volatile food import prices because they simply lack the domestic capacity to substitute those imports. The policy remains just rhetoric without any financial teeth.
And we see a similar reliance on external rather than internal solutions when we look at trade and transport. The government's policy focus seems to be on diplomatic efforts. They're lobbying the International Maritime Organization, the IMO, for a carve-out against rising global shipping costs.
Now, proactive diplomacy is helpful, of course, but it is not a budgeted, guaranteed solution for a domestic economic problem.
What's crucially missing is the domestic financial commitment to solve the regional transport woes that increase the cost of doing business.
Right. The sources note the critical lack of specific funded capital allocation for the establishment of LAAT 2020, the proposed regional airline successor or funding for a dedicated regional transport vessel. Relying solely on lobbying the IMO is a long-shot external fix. A dedicated multi-million-dollar capital line item for LAAT 2020 would be a concrete, budgeted structural solution to reduce regional shipping costs and stabilize internal trade. It would address the import problem head-on.
All these ministerial gaps, the late payments, the repeated promises, the lack of capital funding, It all leads us inevitably back to the political calculus that seems to be underpinning this entire document, particularly when it comes to wage relief for those essential public service employees we discussed earlier.
Right. And the auditor identifies this process as the wage gimmick.
The wage gimmick. Explain that.
Every year, the high-impact December double salary is celebrated by the government as a bonus, or this great gesture of goodwill. However, the sources confirm that this payment is merely a settlement of retroactive arrears. The government is just paying money they already owed, sometimes for work that was performed years ago.
But it's strategically spun and politically timed to feel like a financial windfall.
It's an incredibly effective public relations maneuver to mask years of underpayment. And this mechanism enables the strategic delay of true wage relief. The crucial promise of a future permanent raise in the current wage rate is made conditional on the July 2026 reclassification process.
So it's not happening now, it's happening later, maybe?
Exactly. By tying the permanent raise to a future conditional event, a comprehensive reclassification that is notoriously complex and subject to delay, the government achieves two key things. First, they get the political credit for promising the raise now. And second, and far more critically, this strategic delay protects the current EC $116.3 million surplus for the 2026 fiscal year. They push the real substantial financial burden of the permanent raise into a future budget cycle, ensuring the triumphant headline figures hold for this specific budget year.
Which brings us to the ultimate institutional failure when it comes to accountability, what the sources are calling the accountability void.
This is the capstone of the entire critique. The commentary concludes that, due to the continued strategic absence of a functioning Public Accounts Committee, or PAC, the budget's figures lack fundamental integrity.
Okay, if we connect this to the bigger picture, we need to rigorously define what the function of the PC is. What is it supposed to do?
So, the Public Accounts Committee is a core pillar of parliamentary oversight. Its job is to ensure that public funds from previous years, so not the budget we're discussing now, but the funds from 2024 and earlier, have been administered, managed properly, and spent in line with the law and the budget that was passed by Parliament. They look back and they verify every dollar.
They're the auditors for the auditors.
In a way, yes. They provide that crucial layer of legislative oversight. So the severe implication of the continued absence of a functioning PAC is that there is no independent legislative verification of the government's financial management.
So therefore,
the EC $2.078 billion budget for 2026, despite its impressive headline numbers, remains fundamentally a document of unverified claims. We are being asked as citizens to accept a complex financial plan for the future without having the independent legislative means to verify the responsible management of the budgets from the past. This renders the entire discussion about efficiency, allocation, and even the existence of that $116 million surplus inherently suspect. It is the ultimate check and balance failure.
It transforms the budget from a blueprint of guaranteed action into, well, a list of political intentions, because there's no mechanism to hold the government to account for the failures or the successes of the prior year. You can't rigorously audit a financial plan if you haven't been allowed to audit the previous ones. It's a profound institutional liability. So what does this all mean?
That's the big question.
We started this deep dive with the government's powerful narrative of macroeconomic triumph. We had that celebrated 61.4% debt to GDP ratio and the headline, a $116.3 million surplus. But by rigorously unpacking the source material and the critique from the People's Auditor, we found that the 2026 budget is far more complex and, frankly, far more fragile than those headline figures suggest.
It's a very different picture once you look under the hood.
We've identified that the surplus seems to be heavily funded by regressive hidden taxes like the gas duty, which is paid for by a public that sees no commensurate improvement in core services like roads. That's the public contribution paradox.
We expose the structural inequity between the privileged political elite, who secure robust pensions and lavish benefits after just a few short tenures, and the essential cogs of the public service, who often struggle near the minimum wage and suffer these chronic, demoralizing late payments.
The core critique, as it's synthesized by the auditor, is that this budget has to be recognized not just as a statement of prosperity achieved, but as a demand for urgent structural accountability.
Right. It exposes the political rhetoric and this long list of recycled promises, the new prison, the Fiends and Clareview relocation, the promised NHI transformation, staff wages that appear year after year without a concrete, underfunded capital line item commitment.
So the sources are arguing that citizens deserve a budget that shifts its focus.
Exactly. From accumulating these macro surpluses, which are often protected through strategic delays like that wage gimmick, to one that truly guarantees structural dignity for every resident. And that dignity has to be built on transparent spending, fair wages for essential workers, and genuinely funded, executable solutions for these crisis-level institutions, rather than just relying on external lobbying or political sequencing. The sources are demanding action, not just allocation.
The analysis of this source material leaves us with a critical, final, provocative thought for you, the listener, to consider. And it ties back to that central issue of institutional verification.
The sheer volume of underfunded and perpetually promised initiatives, from the new prison to the Clairview relocation, combined with a strategic delay of permanent wage increases, all of this exists within a system that completely lacks the core legislative verification mechanism of the Public Accounts Committee.
Given this total absence of PAC oversight, which means we can't verify the integrity of past spending, and this extensive list of annual, repeated promises that never seem to materialize into capital projects.
How can citizens effectively distinguish between a sincere government priority that will actually receive funding and be executed in 2026 versus an annual political performance that's just designed to generate headlines and protect the surplus until the next budget cycle? That ultimately is the question of trust that hangs over this entire $2.078 billion document.
A vital question of operational integrity indeed. Thank you for joining us on this deep dive into the intersection of fiscal stability and structural dignity. We encourage you to explore these concepts further and scrutinize the finances in your own backyard.